Okay, so for this first review video, we're going to cover the technological and environmental transformations to up to 600 BCE. Um, so this is everything that happened prior to really the growth of civilizations. So this is the formation of civilizations, this is the agricultural revolution, all sorts of stuff like that. So the term big geography, it draws attention to like the global nature of world history. So throughout the Paleolithic period, humans were migrating from Africa to Eurasia, Australia, the Americas, all over the place. And early humans were very mobile and they were creative in their adaptation to different geographical settings, like you've got savanna, desert, tundra, and within those different areas, they also developed a lot of sophisticated technologies. So we'll talk about all those within this um, within this presentation. So if you look at the map, you can see the migration of anatomically modern humans. Now, what that means is we're talking about the people who looked the most like us. Now, there were Homo sapiens that existed prior to our iteration, but they were not what we're actually like talking about. So the early humans, they were very mobile and they were creative. And by making an analogy with like modern hunter-forager societies, anthropologists can infer that these bands were relatively egalitarian. So humans also developed varied and sophisticated technologies within this time period. So as you see on the map, you've got various types of tools and where we have seen evidence of humans and at what points in time. Now, this map isn't entirely accurate because about a couple of weeks ago, it was released that they actually found human evidence in North America about 100,000 years before they really thought so. So you'll start to see things change a little bit there. But just know we're looking at the last 100,000 years or so of movement out of Africa. So archaeological evidence indicates that during the Paleolithic era, you've got hunting, foraging bands, so hunter-gatherers, of humans gradually migrated from their origins and adapting their technologies to these new climates. So humans developed increasingly diverse and sophisticated tools like multiple uses of fire. So humans used fire in new ways, like to aid in hunting and foraging, to protect against predators, and to adapt to cold environments. And people lived in small groups that structured social, economic, and political activity. And within that, they exchanged people, ideas, goods. So you start to see these different civilizations crop up that are sharing ideas. So now you're into the Neolithic Revolution and early agricultural society. So about 10,000 years ago, the Neolithic Revolution led to development of more complex economic and social systems. So people were starting to settle down a little bit. And within that, you create new social and economic systems as well as political systems. So you've got agricultural villages, possibly as a response to climatic change, like the Little Ice Age, or permanent agricultural villages emerged first in the lands of the Eastern Mediterranean. So you're looking at agricultural emerging independently in Mesopotamia, the Nile River Valley, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Indus River Valley, the Yellow River or Huanghe River Valley, Papua New Guinea, Mesoamerica, and the Andes. So we don't know why they developed independently, where they developed, all at the same time, essentially. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, if you're looking at it, they really did develop all at about the same time. Even if we look at it and it's 500 or 1,000 years difference, it really is about the same time. So people in each region domesticated locally available plants and animals. It makes sense. You're not going to domesticate a camel in the middle of the Canada. Like you're just not going to. So it makes sense that camels were domesticated in Africa and in your Asian areas. So you domesticate the animals that work well for your area. Same with plants. I'm not going to find sugarcane being grown in Alaska because it doesn't work. Same with like rice. I'm not going to find that in Alaska, but I am going to find rice in Vietnam and China and Korea because it is a more appropriate climate. And I'm going to find like sugarcane down in the middle of Central America. and further down into South America. So you grow and use what makes sense for your location. Pastoralism developed in Afro-Eurasian grasslands, which negatively affected the environment when lands were overgrazed because they're eating too much grass. So remember, pastoralism was people who followed looking for pastures for their migratory animals. So that could be like your cattle, that could be your sheep, stuff like that. Horses also. Agricultural communities had to work cooperatively to clear the land and create water control systems because you need to have water in order to grow crops, which also drastically affected environmental diversity because if you are over farming an area or if you are relying on rivers, you could have some drought and therefore famine. You have to harness the power of the world around you in order to get a successful society, which is exactly what these people were doing. If you look at the top image on the right, you can see the Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro. So not only were they figuring out how to irrigate for their crops, they were also figuring out major systems of like bathing so that people didn't go down all the way to the river to bathe. They bathed right in the city. So kind of a cool way to think about it. If you look at the middle picture in the top, you're looking at basically a port system, an early port system where people would come, like the water is channeled into the middle of the city and economic activity happens in that specific area. Agriculture and pastoralism began to transform the human society, so they led to more reliable and abundant food supplies, which increases the population. If you have more food that's reliable, obviously your population size is going to increase. So surpluses of food and other goods lead to specialization of labor. If you have too much food, people need to have something else to do. So you've got new classes of artisans and warriors and a development of an elite class as well. Technological innovations led to a lot of improvements in agricultural production, trade, transportation. You've got pottery being created to store like water, food, stuff like that. You have plows making it easier to farm. Woven textiles now, instead of just basic clothing, you now have more sophisticated clothing, and also it helps with like blankets and it helps with housing textiles, and it helps with so many different things. You've got wheels and wheeled vehicles which aid in transportation and in agricultural production, and then metallurgy, making stuff with metal. That absolutely helps in pretty much every facet of life. Now, in both pastoralist and agrarian societies, elite groups accumulated wealth, which created more hierarchical social structures and it promoted patriarchal forms of social organization. So, if you take a look at this is the Egyptian society, but I mean, do you see any women on that hierarchy? No, because it was a male dominated society. And that tended to happen in both pastoralist and agrarian societies. So you'll see that as a continuing theme throughout the rest of the periods in AP World History. Now we're moving into the development and interactions of early agricultural, pastoral, and urban societies. So these core and foundational civilizations developed in a few different geographical and environmental settings where the agriculture was able to flourish, like Mesopotamia. You've got Egypt, you got Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, you've got Shang, you've got Olmec, you have the Chauvin. So all of these different groups were able to grow near a river valley. You needed to have that river for a constant source of water. So if you look at the map here, you can see all of the major early river valley civilizations. Again, you've got the Huanghe River Valley region with the Shang. You've got Mesopotamia with the Tigris and Euphrates. You got the Nile River Valley in Egypt. You got the Indus River. You have the Andean region with the Incas. And remember also that the Incas used terrace farming too. Mesoamerica with the Mayans and the Aztecs and so forth. So just generally know where each of those locations are. So the first states emerged within the core civilizations. The states were powerful new systems of rule that were able to mobilize the surplus labor, because remember with agriculture, they've got They got free time now. And you've got surplus resources over these large areas. And the early states then were often led by a ruler whose source of power was believed to be divine or came from the gods, or was supported by the gods, and or somebody who was supported by the military. I mean, obviously, if somebody has a whole lot of big, strong military guys behind him, he's gonna be likely to be a good leader. Or at least a good pick for leader. So you've got the two different ways of becoming ruler. So divine influence or military backing. So as states grew and competed for land and resources, the more favorably situated, like the Hittites, who had access to iron, had a lot greater access to resources, produced more surplus food, and experienced growing populations. Makes sense, right? So if you're in a really good area, like again, the river valleys, you're going to be able to produce more and your population is going to grow. You're going to have new classes being created. You're going to have new jobs being created. It's going to be really, really good. So these states were able to undertake territorial expansion and then conquer surrounding states. So basically making their states even larger. So the early regions of state expansion or empire building were Mesopotamia, Babylonia, and the Nile Valley. So if you look at the map below, you can see actually all three areas, but mostly highlighted, you've got the Assyrians and the Babylonians. As for technology, pastoralists were often the developers and disseminators of the new weapons, obviously because they've got the bigger animals to have to hunt and kill. They made composite bows, like compound bow and arrows, basically, iron weapons, and then new modes of transportation like chariots and horseback riding that transformed warfare in the agrarian civilizations. So these ideas didn't just stay with the pastoralists, they went over to the agricultural communities and they were shared. So culture played a significant role in unifying the states through laws, language, literature, religion, myths, monumental art. So the early civilizations developed monumental architecture and urban planning. So you've got your ziggurats, you've got your pyramids, and the whole purpose of those was A, to show the might of the ruler, but then B, to worship the gods. Now, the pyramids were a little different because they were considered burial places, but also showing the might of the ruler. You've got temples, which were there for worshiping the gods. Defensive walls were created in order to keep out other groups, whether they were nomadic or coming in to try to take the land. Street and road systems. So you've got an infrastructure system being created, which means you have to have a pretty decent political structure. And sewage and water systems were absolutely necessary in any civilization so that you didn't have a mess on your hands. But streets and roads and sewage and water systems, those are pretty big examples of infrastructure that as states became more complex, they started to adapt to the new levels of infrastructure. The elites promoted arts and artisanship, which is another theme that we're going to see over and over again throughout the AP periods. Like at this point in time, the types of arts and artisanship we're looking at is sculpture, paintings, wall decorations, elaborate weavings, basically things that today even still show signs of wealth. You'll also see promoting the arts and artisanship in pretty much every golden period of every civilization, and even when we look to like the Renaissance. So this is a theme you're going to see over and over again throughout AP World History. For record keeping, you have systems of record keeping independently coming up in all the early civilizations, and then subsequently were diffused to other civilizations and areas. So cuneiform, you've got from Sumer in about 3000 BCE. You've got hieroglyphics coming from Egypt from about 3300 BCE. You've got pictographs coming up, which again are very similar to hieroglyphs and cuneiform. Alphabets, remember the Phoenicians. You've got quipu, which wasn't actually like a writing system, but it was definitely a system of knots to keep track of things, which you see pictured there on the bottom right. But that was about 3000 BCE. So you've got these different systems of record keeping all being developed in different geographic areas all about the same time. Granted, Egypt and Sumer are very close to one another, but the Incans, they're oceans away. So, I mean, they're very, very far away, and they were able to develop it at basically the same time. So it's really interesting to see how civilizations developed all at relatively the same time. You have legal codes being developed. Remember how I talked about how things were getting more sophisticated and you had to have sophisticated political structure and infrastructure? Well, legal codes are absolutely part of it. So states developed the legal codes, including the Code of Hammurabi in Babylonia, which you can see on the right there, that big tall pillar that actually has the Code of Hammurabi written on it. And at the top, you see Hammurabi with one of the gods, getting his power from the gods, divine ruler. And the Code of Ur-Nammu in Sumer, which was sometime after the Code of Hammurabi. Those reflected existing hierarchies, and they facilitated the rule of governments over the people. So think about legal codes. They tend to benefit the more elite people, and they tend to keep everybody else generally in control. As for religions, so now you've got free time on your hands and you're starting to think about why things are the way they are. So you've got new religious beliefs being developed in this period, and they continue to have a lot of strong influences in later periods. So the Vedic religions, that was brought by the Aryans over into India, and that was combined with local Hindu traits, and you now have the creation of Hinduism, more of how we know it today. You have Hebrew monotheism being created, and then you have Zoroastrianism being created in Persia. So all of three of these religions are still highly, highly influential today. And even Zoroastrianism is still influential, and still practiced in some small areas. So for trade, obviously you've got these different civilizations now, and they're going to start exploring and they're going to start communicating with each other. So trade expanded throughout this period from local to regional to interregional, with civilizations exchanging goods and cultural ideas and technology. So you've got local trade between Mesopotamia and Egypt. I say local, I mean it's a few hundred miles, but it's still relatively local. So Mesopotamia is in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which you see like highlighted in that orange area. And then you've got Egypt over in the green underneath the Mediterranean Sea. You've also got trade between Egypt and Nubia further south on the Nile River. And then you also have trade between Mesopotamia, again orange, over to the Indus Valley, which is over in the purple. Hierarchies. So social and gender hierarchies intensified as the states expanded and cities multiplied. So not only did the general social structure and gender structure stay the same, they tended to intensify or get more magnified as the states and cities expanded. So you still have generally a pretty strong patriarchy, and your class system tends to stay the same. Your lowest class is always going to tend to be the biggest, and then it keeps getting smaller as it goes up, but your rich get richer and the poor kind of stay the same. You've also got literature being a reflection of culture. So you got the Epic of Gilgamesh at this point in time. You've got the Rig Veda and the Book of the Dead. So all different cultures, all creating these different literatures, as well as oral tradition being still a major component of this period.